Leading Ideas Talks podcast is brought to you by the Lewis Center for Church Leadership of Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Subscribe free to our weekly e-newsletter, Leading Ideas, at churchleadership.com/leading ideas. Leading Ideas Talks is also brought to you by Be the Welcoming Church. With this engaging video resource, you'll learn how your church can make visitors feel truly welcome and comfortable through best practices for developing welcoming worship, church buildings, congregations, and websites. Learn more about Be the Welcoming Church and watch sample videos at churchleadership.com/Be the Welcoming Church. And remember to stay up to date with the latest church leadership strategies and information. Please like and subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to get updates for new videos. How has the pandemic shaped the vitality and resiliency of congregations? And did it really prompt large numbers of pastors to leave the ministry? In this episode, Scott Thumma shares insights from ongoing research on the pandemic's impact on congregational life and health.
Welcome to Leading Ideas Talks, a podcast featuring thought leaders and innovative practitioners. I am Douglas Poe, the director of the Lewis Center, and your host for this talk. Joining me is Dr. Scott Thumma, who is the principal investigator for the Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregations and professor of religion at Hartford International. Our focus for this podcast is early insights from the project of the impact on the pandemic. Scott, I'm so grateful you're joining us today and looking forward to this conversation and your work.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, Douglas. I appreciate talking with your audience and giving you whatever insight I have about this strange situation that we're living in.
Absolutely a strange situation. And let's sort of begin by just having you share a little bit about the project and the work that you're doing, because we all know, of course, because we're living through this pandemic, that it certainly has created an impact, and you're actually studying that impact. So can you share a little bit about what you're doing?
Sure. I was on sabbatical when the pandemic started, and quickly realized as a sociologist of religion that this was going to have a pretty profound effect on congregations, and it did immediately. But the longer the pandemic looked like it was going to go, the more profound I thought the challenges were going to be. And we were in the midst of working on our Faith Communities Today national survey for 2020. Which we eventually collected 15,000 responses from congregations. And most of that was just prior to the pandemic. And so we've taken that as kind of a baseline measure. And I proposed to Lilly Endowment a larger survey to look at how congregations were dealing with the pandemic, but mostly to look at the changes that were going to be happening over time. And so what we put together was a 5-year project that had both survey, key informant survey data attached to it across those 5 years. We had a longitudinal panel component. We also are doing case studies on about 100 congregations in 8 different locations around the country. And then mostly in 2023 and 24, we're going to do a very large attender survey. So we'll be asking people in the pews both how they weathered the pandemic, but also how they're thinking about responding to the challenges of their congregations as they sit in the pews and volunteer and such. And so what we're trying to do is capture as much data around both what congregations did during the pandemic, but then also mostly what they look like in 23, 24, 25, to see, what things really don't look the same as they did in the past. So we'll see how it goes, but thus far it's a challenging time for sure.
I thank you for the overview, and I just want to pick up on where you ended with the challenging time. Given sort of, I know you're early into the project, but how do you think faith leaders have fared, or what is the toll you believe the pandemic has taken on faith leaders, just from your sort of early conversations?
Well, our first survey we did in last summer, we asked the question of, was 2020 the worst year of your ministry? And about 65% said that they had thought that at some point in 2020, which leads me to wonder, like, how rough was it for the other group of people? What are the, maybe it was their first year of ministry, or as one of my colleagues said, maybe they're all introverts and they were just happy to not have to have church. So we don't have to see those people. No. I mean, so it clearly, every religious leader we talk to talks about being exhausted and worn out, and they were on creative overload for so long, and especially in the congregations, probably 250 attendees or less, because they don't have large staff. So it really oftentimes, much of the creative work rested on the shoulders of a single person. And that person many times is half time even. So it was a challenging time for sure.
Let me follow up with that. You wrote an article. The article is a great resignation brewing for pastors. And the connection I want to make here is there's been a lot of talk, of course, about what you just said, the exhaustion, the creativity overload, and all these things taking place for pastors. But in the article, you actually talk about sort of a nuanced perspective that it's not as many people actually leaving ministry as one would believe, because there's been other articles talking about sort of this great pastor resignation. Can you share a little bit about what you wrote and why you're nuancing a little bit this sort of thought that all the pastors are running for the door?
Yes. So in that same survey where we asked, was this the hardest year? We also asked, have you seriously considered leaving the ministry? And we found that about 37 or 38% had said they thought that at one point. And that paralleled very closely to what the Barna Research Institute had found, that 38% said that they thought about leaving the ministry. So on the surface, it looked like, there is this massive number, 40% almost, that want or have been so beaten down by those 2 years of the pandemic that but that just didn't resonate with what I was hearing from clergy. I mean, certainly they were tired, they were worn out, they had been up and down in the roller coaster, but it was clear from my conversations that they weren't ready to get off the ride. They may have thought about it right before they were crashing down at one point, uh, but nevertheless, they were still there. And so one of the aspects of our question was, how often did you think that thought? And so when we started to look at, okay, did they think about it once or twice, or did they a few times, or often, or very often? When you look at the fairly often or very often people who are really pondering this, it really drops to 8%, and the very often really drops to 3%. And that's true not only for leaving the ministry, but also leaving the church that you're out at, or doubting your call to God, right? There is a significant number, somewhere between 25 and 35%, who have thought it, but the people who are really contemplating it drops down to far less than 10%. And the really serious contemplating it is just 3% across the board for all three of those questions. And when we correlated those questions, that 3% is essentially all the same people. So essentially what it's saying is that there really are a small percentage of clergy who have kind of given up on the profession. And when you dig even deeper as to why those folks are thinking this fairly often or very often, you really see that they're in difficult congregations to begin with. All the other measures that we have of conflict or decline over time, or challenging financial situations, all of those are active in the congregations these folks are coming from. So it's not just a matter of, I think, the clergy giving up because of a difficult situation, because of the pandemic, but the pandemic exacerbated what they were already dealing with in the life of these congregations. So I think that seems much more realistic to what I'm hearing and what we're seeing than this, massive, there's this great reshuffling and, folks are resigning. I just think it's more realistic to the reality.
So a couple of follow-up questions. The first one sort of simple. For those who are sort of in that 3%, do you think that, and here I'm asking you to sort of guess, that it's likely they may have left anyway? It may not have been as quickly, but given the circumstances of the congregations they were pastoring, if they weren't in a system where they could be moved, they probably would have eventually left the ministry anyway.
Yes, I do think that's the case, and that in some sense the pandemic offered them an excuse to make the move now, and honestly, that group of 3% look like they wouldn't be happy even if they transferred somewhere else. Right, even though they said they also thought about leaving their congregation. I don't think they would have been satisfied just changing playgrounds kind of thing.
That's interesting and helpful. The other question that strikes me is, and you hinted at this a little bit, you talked about sort of the diversity of congregations in terms of denominations, size. I'm going to throw race in there. So can you speak a little bit about how that complicates your study for the impact of COVID? Because you talked about those under 250 were impacted more significantly than larger congregations. So as you start looking at these variables, does it make it sort of hard to really figure out the impact of COVID? Because the reality is some of these congregations would have struggled regardless of COVID. Am I making sense?
Yeah. Yes. It's challenging to say the least. In part because obviously the dynamics are still going on. Right?
Yeah,
I mean, almost no congregation has recovered in any sort of sense of the word. So it's still in motion, and so that makes it difficult. But also part of our Faith Communities Today project, which has been going on since 2000, and you all have covered wonderfully over the years, really does show that these trends that we're seeing in the moment around the pandemic were trends that have been developing for the last 20 years. And so anytime I do a talk about our EPIC project, the exploring the pandemic's impact on congregations, I always begin now with a rehearsal of the fact data, the Faith Communities Today data across time, because what we're seeing in the pandemic moment is really just an extension of what has already been happening. And some of that has to do with changes around racial makeup of congregations. Some of it has to do with immigration. A lot of it has to do with the shifting size dynamics in American congregations. And and I think the pandemic has obviously it stressed all of all congregations, but it really just intensified some of those patterns, I think, that we saw prior to it. So it is hard to tease out which aspects of this are directly due to the pandemic. Although, and then when you throw in sort of the the racial unrest that took place over the last several years, and also the political unrest that took place over the last several years, um, and then the challenges around masking and closures and vaccinations around the pandemic. Um, Congregations, social entities, even society as a whole, is in a moment of significant turmoil. And so, how much of each of those play a part in what we're seeing is a really interesting question. And I'm hoping that maybe not in the immediate, but 5 years down the road, we'll have enough data that maybe some smart statisticians will be able to pull some of this apart. Uh, but I want to retire by then, so I'm no. My main goal with the project is to try to get good, helpful information out to clergy and to congregations as quickly as we can.
Right.
And so that's my main emphasis right now. The real challenging questions come down the road when we have some time to do more analysis.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let me shift a little bit, but it's still sort of in the same vein. Given what you just said, and we could sort of look at the trajectory of even going back, you say 15, 20 years, how do you think the pandemic has impacted vitality? And for the Religious Workforce Project, Tim Snyder, who's our principal investigator, used the words resilience. Like, do you see that congregations really have exhibited resilience and in some cases real vitality, even in the midst of all the turmoil you just described?
Yeah, that was one of the surprising pieces of the first survey that we did, because on the one hand, we clearly had um, relatively devastating uh, results of decline in attendance and significant decline in volunteering, uh, closure of various programs, no fellowship activities that knit people together. Uh, but at the same time, you had uh, an institution that is not known for being willing to change, and certainly not change rapidly, almost transform itself overnight in terms of uh, how they did worship, how they jumped on online giving and live streaming and in those early days when we were interviewing, or well, actually almost a year and a half into the pandemic, we are interviewing pastors, and a lot of them were saying, we're really proud of all that we've done. We beat, one of them said, we beat the pandemic, because they actually motivated their people to change and to adapt and to innovate. And I would not have ever guessed that. You know, I thought a lot more were just going to close down and wait this out, based on the previous decades of research I've done on congregations. They're just not known for, nimbleness, until they get, very, very large in many ways. So it was very clear organizationally that there was a willingness to survive, and that created quite a bit of resilience and innovation. The other place that we saw, or that I saw in the data, just amazing resilience, is around some of those same questions to the clergy. Um, what we talked about already. How many of them had a fleeting thought about this is terrible, but clearly weren't giving up. And we also had a battery of uh, kind of mental health and physical health and resilient sort of questions like that. And it looked like there was a little bit of suffering or so, but until I compared it to the average American on some of those same scores. And then clergy actually were looking much healthier than than the average person on the street, both prior to the pandemic and in the early years of the year of the pandemic. So um, it showed that no matter how much clergy were grumbling and worn out and exhausted, um, nevertheless they were faring well, and I took a lot of hope in that. You know, it's obviously not over, and clergy have to continue to think about how to adapt and innovate, because the world that they're coming out of the pandemic into is not the world that they left prior to the pandemic. So, in some sense, that moment of creativity and flexibility is not over, but it's the perfect time for congregations to continue to innovate, because the fallow ground has kind of been broken up for the last 2 years, and so now is a good time to plant some new seeds, I think.
Have you discovered in conversations recently that they are still able to do some of the innovation, or are you finding that individuals are sort of slipping back into what they were doing previous to the impact of the pandemic?
Yeah, that's that's the real question, is
Yeah,
sort
it
of
is. Yes,
what comes next.
right. That's
um,
right.
I mean, as things continue to evolve, I do we see both stories in the
Okay.
data, uh, and I think that's it's going to be a it's going to be interesting to watch it develop over time. But what we see, is clearly there are at least 30 to 40% of congregations that uh, have taken this to heart and are continuing to try new things in their Sunday school programs, to tweak the worship service so that it's more adaptable for hybrid, both virtual and in-person worship, uh, creative ways of continuing to do committee meetings, all these sorts of things. And then you see maybe 50% of congregations that um, are drifting back to old patterns and old habits, and unfortunately it does correlate a lot with size. um, so it's incredibly easy to understand, right? I mean, if you're a 60-person congregation and you have a three-quarter time pastor, um, there's just not the resources and not the energy oftentimes, because maybe half those people are over the age of 60 or 65, and so it's challenging, I think, for a lot of congregations, but also some congregations live in areas that weren't that directly affected by the pandemic. Their social patterns haven't changed that much, as opposed to other more suburban and urban areas that are, um, the world is completely different than before. So it's going to it, it will take a number of years, I think, to understand what really shakes out of all of this. But um, there are probably going to be some winners and some losers. And
Yeah.
you know, we went into the pandemic knowing full well that there are probably too many congregations, um, and that's part of the shifting, the declining size of congregations is, populations have moved around in our country, but you can't pick up a congregation, the building and everything, and move it too. So those places that have gained people through migration and immigration don't have enough congregations, therefore they get bigger. And the places where they've left, like New England or the central Midwest or whatever, or small and rural areas, those congregations are increasingly smaller and smaller. Um, and so the pandemic just kind of amplified that dynamic.
Well, Scott, as we prepare to close our time together, I just want to finish with letting you sort of reflect on, and you've talked a little bit about this, but what are you hoping to sort of share with pastors and congregations in the next 12 months that you think will be able to help them maybe to even address some of the challenges that you've raised, because of the pandemic, but actually started even before the pandemic? So, what is it that you're hoping that you will be able to share with the data you're collecting?
Yes, well, we continue to survey. We just closed out our third pandemic survey, and so within the coming weeks, we'll be putting out two different reports. One about religious education and how congregations have um, adapted their Sunday school programs, their adult religious education programs, uh, both during the pandemic and what kind of creativity they used with those. But then also a longer trend of how things are changing over time. We're trying to map that about every 6 months, if possible. So those both will be coming out soon. And as I said, we really want clergy and congregational leaders to get the facts. And it's one thing to kind of hear what's going on around you, but to see more broadly how congregations are adapting and changing, and what practices work best, I think will be very helpful for clergy. And then we're also now deep in these case studies, and so we're trying to hear the stories and listen to people doing interviews, doing focus groups and observations within congregations. So we'll not just have, the sky high sort of statistical hope picture, but we're also trying to fill that in with some rich examples and other stories. And so we're hoping that in the short run over this next year, that will help give clergy um, and other leaders a better picture of what's really going on. Oftentimes, you get kind of lost in the details of your own situation and think you're alone in experiencing some of these things. But we hope that what we find will uh, just give clergy both some hope and also some answers and resources.
Well, Scott, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. And even though I've been following and reading, I still learned some new things about your work, and I look forward to those future reports.
Well, thank you, Douglas. It's wonderful talking with you. And if any of your listeners want to be a part of this, they can go to our website at covidreligionresearch.org and volunteer to be a part, have their congregation be a part, and we might even have honorarium for some of them.
Thanks for joining us for Leading Ideas Talks. Please like and subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to get updates for new videos.